Hi friends, welcome back or welcome if you're new here. My name is Mali and welcome to my November wrap up. November was a pretty good reading month for me. I read 7 books in November and we'll be talking about those 7 books in a minute. At the beginning, it seemed like I had a bunch of duds, but I would say that I evened out. So I'm really happy about that. Yeah, without further ado, let's get started. The very first book that I read in the month of November was Liars by Sarah Manguso. This is a literary thriller on the horrors of marriage, and this was honestly the spookiest thing I've read all year. This follows Jane, an aspiring writer, and John, who's also an aspiring filmmaker. They meet very early on in the book. The two fall in love and get married. But from the very beginning, we know that this is not going to be a simple story because John is the worst. The entire book is narrated by Jane like a sort of diary, and we see how their romance blossoms and also the red flags that Jane so blatantly ignores. Later, when they get married, she very quickly becomes pregnant, and from then on, not only does she become a wife, but also a mother, which are two things that she didn't want to become, right? She knew very early on that if she did those things, that she wouldn't be able to pursue her career as a writer, as a creative. It doesn't help that John's ego doesn't allow her to continue writing. He undermines her work and is very openly jealous when she wins a creative retreat in Greece. But despite it all, she tries her best to continue a writing routine, but she does find it a little bit hard to manage with a newborn baby in tow and the incompetence of her husband. He was always off traveling for work and investing in business deals that will only go bankrupt a couple of months later. And when he was in the house, he was just useless. He wouldn't help with housework or even raising their child. This was a really stunning and frustrating read and the perfect type of book to read in under 24 hours, which I did in this vlog up here. There were so many instances where I wanted to grab Jane by the shoulders and like shake her awake. Wake up, he's playing you. But I know perfectly well that when you're in that situation, you don't really see it. You don't see the red flags, you put up with it, and you don't know that he's gaslighting you, that what you're going through is abuse until years later. Honestly, I will never get tired of fiction that explores motherhood and complicated family dynamics, especially when it's done in a way that Manguso does it. It's sharp, compelling, and I personally couldn't stop reading. Also, no shade, but this is what Night Bitch wanted to be. After that, I picked up Maglu by Ottessa Moshfegh. This has the honor of being my least favorite Moshfegh ever, and I think I can confidently say that because I've read every one of her works except for Homesick for Another World, which I've also heard iffy things about. I also think I wasn't really in the mood for this one because tell me why this won an award for his writing style. Meanwhile, here I was struggling to get through some 140 pages. Like, it's very short. In Maglu, we follow this rough and drunken sailor who's been accused of killing his best friend in a drunken brawl. He doesn't really remember anything that happened that night though, and believes that everybody around him is pulling a prank on him. He's being transported to his hometown Salem, where he will await trial for murder. The narrative goes into flashbacks of his time with the friend he supposedly killed, times when they used to get along and started their lives as sailors. Problem with this book is that I just didn't care for it. I didn't like our main character as he was downright villainous with no redemption arc. He was crass, he couldn't stop saying slurs, which started to make me a little bit uncomfortable once I reflected that this was written by a white cis woman. Like, maybe chill with the F-bomb slurs, Ottessa. And talking about that, our main character openly hated gay people and will constantly call them the F slur. But did anybody else get like a sort of gay vibe between him and his bestie? The call is coming from inside the house. This next one is also going to be a quick one, and that's because I read and hated 19 Claws and a Blackbird by Angustina Basterica. I genuinely could not tell you what goes on in this book because one, it was forgettable. And secondly, nothing ever does happen. This was personally the worst short story collection I have ever read in such a long time. And I had such high hopes for this one because this is the author of Tender is the Flesh. And I was really excited about the idea of a similar dystopian horror-ish vibe from this collection, except the only horror I got was how awful this was. Not one of the stories in here felt satisfying in any way, and most of them seemed to try to create like a vibe and less much a story. The entire collection seemed incomplete for me, like if these were rough drafts or loose notes of a bigger story that Basterica was trying to develop. It's such a shame because honestly I really wanted to enjoy this one. I was really excited. I wanted the spooky vibes, and I do love a good short story collection because they can be as fleshed out and interesting as a novel. I think to create a good short story you need some type of experience. You need to know what you're doing basically, and I don't think Basterica knew what she was doing. I think she should stick to full-length novels, and please never attempt to write a short story collection again. And because of this experience with her short story collection, I'm actually really nervous about her upcoming release that I was initially really excited for, but it does comes out early 2025 and it's titled The Unworthy. It sounds so good, so I'm hoping that it doesn't let me down. Finally, I picked up a good book. I picked up La Mala Costumbre, and I seemed to get out of that bad luck I was having my previous read. I think this is a book that I will scream about forever. So I did read this one in Spanish, but there is an English translation currently out. It was published earlier this year, and the title is Bad Habits. La Mala Costumbre is narrated by a young trans girl living in a lower class neighborhood in Spain. And the narration shows us how living in her particular neighborhood shaped how she grew up, as she was only a child when she started feeling weird and wrong in her body. The examples she had growing up around her only helped her in making her more confused. And I'm not exactly proud to say this, but us Latinos and Hispanics, we're extremely sexist and homophobic, and a lot of our language is built around that fact. So to have a young child, especially one like our narrator, be constantly exposed to that hate speech that we throw around so casually, it's damaging to them. And that's honestly something that a lot of us have to reflect on, how we use our language. I really like that the neighborhood felt like its own character in this novel. I also thought that the way the narrator looked at her home city served as a sort of love letter. She especially looks up to the older trans women in her city. She's so mesmerized by them, and she looks up at them like, you know how kids look up at people and they think of them as like superheroes or like fairies and princesses? That's how she sees them, but she's also terrified of them because she sees her future in them. She sees a life of hardship, resistance, and hate. These older trans women serve her as a sort of guide that she refers back to constantly as she's growing up and figuring herself out. And later, as a young woman, she begins to expose herself to the world. She's sneaking off to Madrid to dance at gay bars. She's dressing up as a girl in the middle of the night. She develops fragile relationships with both men and women, especially older trans women. And while it seems that everything's going good and right for her, something happens, unfortunately, that makes her question if she can continue living as a woman honestly and happily. I'm not going to lie, I teared up at a lot of scenes in this novel. It's honestly such a raw and heartbreaking book. I love the out of fiction feel to the narration. The writing in this is also phenomenal. It's so good. It was also such a treat to read this in the original Spanish. Every sentence here is precise and to the point. There's no skating around the topic. It's honestly some of the most touching writing I've read in quite a bit, and every paragraph seemed to sort of wring my heart out. La Mala Costumbre is set in the late 80s and 90s, and this is an era in which many queer people fought for the rights that exist today. And while this book does deal with some heavy topics, there's some beautiful feeling of resistance, strength, and hope that is found in the text. And when I say that this is one of the better queer coming-of-age novels I've read in a long time, I don't say that lightly. I then read Bad Cree by Jessica Johns, and honestly, at first, I didn't think that I will like this one at all because I have seen some mid reviews, but I ended up liking this one quite a bit. In this one, we follow Mackenzie, a young girl who's having nightmares about her dead sister Sabrina. And not only that, but she also brings things back from her dreams. Very quickly, it's obvious that her dreams are trying to tell her something, and so she goes back to her hometown to seek help from her family, who she hasn't seen since her sister's funeral. Back home, Mackenzie is welcomed by her mom, sibling, cousins, and many aunts, but being back home isn't easy. She finds her home suffocating with all the grief that seems to hang around the family like a sort of fog. Eventually, Mackenzie's dreams seem to lead back to a particular summer night in which Sabrina came back from being lost in the woods for some minutes. Something that I learned about myself this year is that I love a horror that's actually an exploration of grief. Bonus points if it also has some seasoning. What do I mean by that? Is that I love a person of color horror. In this case, Sabrina and her family are Cree, which is a Native American tribe from the Canadian region. The indigenous twist in this book gave the horror and the supernatural themes a bit of more oomph, which honestly I thought was super cool. This genuinely spooked me in some parts, but this is not only a horror. Like I mentioned earlier, there's some pretty heavy themes of grief that Mackenzie and her family are not healed from. Family is also a pretty big topic in this book. I can also sort of understand the mid reviews in this. A lot of people mentioned that it dragged on, and it does drag on just a little bit towards the middle. I personally didn't mind it, but I do think that if I was in a sort of mood, I would have noticed it a lot more. I definitely recommend this to you if you're looking for horror with a little extra something, because while this was spooky at times, it was also full of heart and so much love. With this next one, I'm very sad to say that this is one of my biggest disappointments of 2024, and I'm talking about Passion Tide by Monique Roffey. I was so excited for this. Passion Tide is set in a fictional island in the Caribbean, and every year during Carnival, tons of people travel to the island to be part of the parade and festivities. Sora Tanaka is one of such people, but when she's found dead, the island is put on a spotlight. Femicide and misogyny are themes that are quite prevalent in Passion Tide. After Sora Tanaka is found, it's clear that she was murdered. A fact that women from the island are not surprised that it's common for women to be found dead or even beaten due to domestic violence. Tired of this everyday violence and outrage at how poorly the Tanaka case is handled by authorities and the police, the women of the island come together and create a revolution never before seen in the Caribbean. So my issue with Passion Tide is that it's so damn boring. There were pages and pages of the female-led revolution, and while it should have been more interesting, it managed to feel incredibly dragged out. I wish the entire thing had more of a nuanced take, more emotion, less plot, more of an internal struggle. You guys know this because I wouldn't shut up about this, but my favorite book of this year, and possibly of all time, is The Mermaid of Black Conch by this very same author. And one of the things that I really liked from that book in particular is that it seemed to perfectly balance out plot and the characters. In Passion Tide, it was just plot, and I don't like that. I don't like plot heavy books. I also don't think that it worked out for the themes that it dealt with in here. I mean, having a friend be brutally murdered is pretty damn emotional, yet it managed to not show a singular emotion besides anger in any of the characters. I was very sadly disappointed by Passion Tide, which is damn shame because I was so excited for this novel. I literally begged the publisher to send me a copy, and they did. But now it's awkward because I didn't like this. But anyways, thank you, Knopf Publishing, for sending me this gifted copy. The last book I'll be talking about is Margaret and the Mystery of the Missing Body by Megan Milk. This one, we follow the titular Margaret as she's a preteen and later on as a teen, and how it is exactly that she lands at a center for eating disorders. So obviously, please check trigger warnings before picking up this book, especially if you have experience with eating disorders and self-harm. But that being said, it's not graphic at all, and it's not used as like a shock device. It's tactful and insightful in how it deals with these sensitive topics. So in a broad sense, this book is a queer coming of age novel, but it's also a detective novel. There's also paranormal elements. The book is sort of a mashup in genres. It's a bit experimental as well. This book has some of that childhood whimsy that's missing in today's media. This is especially so because the author has talked about how books like The Babysitter's Club and Goosebumps had greatly influenced them when it came to writing this novel. This is divided in two parts. The first part is Margaret as a middle schooler and her group of friends who together make the Girls Can Solve Anything Club, in which they go around solving mysteries. This first part was definitely my favorite, as the structure really reminded me of the Nancy Drew chapter books I used to love as a kid. But at the same time the girls are solving mysteries, they're also dealing with adolescence and how that shapes them. Some of them, for example, are more interested in boys than the club, and they start being more preoccupied with their bodies. For Margaret, her body has always been a sore subject as she grew up as a former fat kid. She lands into a treatment center where she tries to unlearn conventional beauty standards and slowly blossoms into her own. I nearly forgot to mention that this book is queer. Margaret is so gay. Poor baby is also trying to figure out her sexuality and later her identity, completely rejecting girlhood. This was a very fun coming of age novel about the messiness of being a teen. And if you can handle the topics explored in this book, please pick this up. It's so good. It's a one-of-a-kind novel. Definitely be recommending this to people, but with caution, of course. Okay, guys, so those are the 7 books that I read in the month of November. I think my favorites for the month were definitely La Mala Costumbre, and then Margaret and the Mystery of the Missing Body is a close second. Those two were really, really fun. And of course, they were queer coming of age. I love a queer coming of age, if you guys haven't noticed. So that was my reading month. Please let me know if you guys have read any of the books that I've read, if you think the same way I do, or you think completely different. Please let me know. I love discussing books down in the comments, whether we agree or not. So yeah, let me know what you guys read in the month of November. What were your favorites of the month? Bye. Love you.